Did he mistweet when he said that? 'Cause he's pretty direct. He says this is not acceptable. They are spending too much time trying to prove Russia.
I think he's making the point that we would like our FBI agencies to not be focused on something that is clearly a hoax in terms of investigating the Trump campaign and its involvement.
What? She remains a marvel, doesn't she?
You are listening to TMI for the week of February 26, 2018.
Calling David Feldman. Hello, David.
Yeah, hi.
It's another David calling.
Hello, David. David Archer.
Yeah.
Thank you for inviting me.
I'm a huge fan of yours. Pardon me for being a little starstruck.
Oh, stop. Thank you. I'll take it. I'll take it wherever I can get it, so thank you.
Recent episode of yours, a line, if you want to get guns off the street in Chicago, get rid of the streets in Chicago. David Feldman is an American comedy writer, stand-up comedian, radio host, and podcaster. He began as stand-up comic in San Francisco and currently resides in New York City. Comedy album Left Without Paying, comedy album The Very Best of the David Feldman Show. Feldman has won 3 Primetime Emmys as a comedy writer, 4 Writers Guild Awards, and a Cable Ace Award. He's written for Comedy Central's The Burn, Joey Behar's Say Anything on current TV, ABC's Roseanne, HBO's Dennis Miller Live, HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, Comedy Central's The Daily Show with Jon Stewart, and Fox's Talk Show with Spike Feresten. He's written for the Academy Awards, the Emmys, Triumph the Insult to Dog comic, for roasts on Comedy Central, written with and for Steve Martin, Martin Short, Robin Williams, Nathan Lane, Robert Smigel, Bette Midler. He's appeared on Late Night with Conan O'Brien many times, The Tonight Show, The Late Late Show, as well as he has a special on Comedy Central. He hosts the Ralph Nader radio show with Ralph Nader and Steve Skrovan, distributed via the Pacifica radio network. David Feldman speaks to us from his proctologist's waiting room in New York.
Thank you for having me, David. I appreciate it.
Wow. Where do we start with news in the United States? I mean, just on Friday there were the indictments.
You know, it must be interesting living someplace else and seeing the forest and not keep, bumping into the trees here. Because when you live here, it's pretty ugly, repulsive, and disgusting. And it's hard to, keep your faith in everything that you were told about this country. I think the gift of Trump is, if there's a gift, it's forcing us to grow up and stop believing in all the myths that we were, inculcated with, trained to believe.
It seems 1/3 is behind Trump and 2/3 didn't take the voting seriously.
Is that the number? That seems about.
Well, his base is always sort of 33-ish.
Yeah.
Yeah. Approval. And 2/3, they were busy with their cell phones or thought it would be fun to have a Kardashian or the Beverly Hillbillies version of a presidency. But will this wake up people who weren't taking it seriously?
I hope so. I always try to find some kind of silver lining. There is some value to having Trump in the Oval Office. I'll get to that in a second. To me, the real issue is ICE. ICE is the immigration police. They are part of Homeland Security. ICE is rounding up undocumented workers, destroying families, sending them to private prisons, dropping people off in Guatemala and Mexico who came to this country when they were 10 and are now 40. They are ruining lives, and they are basically a criminal operation. They're almost like an extrajudicial arm of the Justice Department. They fall under the Department of Homeland Security. They are not monitored properly, and they run the danger of becoming the Republican Party's secret police. Wow. Because the more Donald Trump denudes the FBI of its authority, I mean, right now they're blaming the school shooting on the FBI, right, instead of the NRA. As the FBI loses more and more of its authority, it creates a vacuum for ICE to fill, and ICE could very easily become America's secret police. I think the people who work for ICE are disgusting human beings. They are the enemy of America. They are the Gestapo. They're rounding up people in the middle of the night and putting them in private prisons or sending them away. That will be the legacy of the Trump administration and the American people, that we have sat back and allowed families to be destroyed this way, lives to be destroyed this way. The people who work for ICE are cowards. They're not going to go after MS-13, these gangs, because MS-13 has guns. So it's much easier to round up a woman who's checking in with immigration to renew her visa. It's much easier to round her up than it is to take on the gang members. People who work for ICE are cowards.
There's talk of revising America's policy on immigration and always comparing Canada to the United States. I can't help myself. We've had a merit-based immigration system for a long, long time. And I've always thought it was a little bit cruel because it seemed to be tending to favor rich people. But then when you compare it to, what do you think?
I'm not that familiar with the Canadian immigration.
Yeah.
I do know that every time I go to Canada, I ask what it would take for me to become a citizen. And I'm told I need $500,000 that I have to put in a bank account.
Or I think if you have a skill that is unique or desired.
Yeah, I don't know if the skill of crapping on America is that valuable in Canada.
You would be the first comedian who left America and came to Canada.
Well, I'll tell you, I'm here to fight for the country,
yeah.
You know, for America. This is not who we are. It's who, you know, some of us are. So, and, you know, I think the American people, by the way, are paying a price for their indifference.
Yeah.
But this is not what we want.
On Thursday, Wolf Blitzer, for the first time ever, earned his pay as a journalist by holding Rick Scott's feet to the fire. I don't know if you saw that little chunk. But, you know, he kept asking, Wolf Blitzer was basically saying, you know, we're fed up with this. When are things going to change? And then, of course, the answer that came back, you know, included, you know, 10,000 words, not one word about guns. And Wolf Blitzer, to his credit, kept asking, and each time he asked the question, you know, more and more he put the word guns into this question. And over, Rick Scott did the same thing the president did, which is just simply not mention gun policy.
Yeah. Well, the NRA spent $32 million electing Donald Trump. The NRA spent $32 million in 2016 to get Donald Trump elected president. There's pretty convincing evidence that the Russians, the oligarchs, were funneling money to the NRA, which then went to Donald Trump. The Russian scandal is interesting, but it's kind of, we should be immune to tampering from the Russians. We should be a better people. We should have a much better capacity for critical thinking to know the difference between the New York Times and a troll farm producing garbage. But when you tell a generation or 3 generations of Americans to stop reading and just eat and buy things, all critical thinking goes out the window. So there is a problem of several generations of Americans since Reagan who celebrate what they buy and what they eat and peak television, and it makes us really susceptible to nonsense from the Russians and the NRA and a guy like Donald Trump. I mean, I watched Donald Trump walking through the hospital in Florida the other night, and I thought, well, he's doing a good job there. That's ceremonial. He looks like he cares. You fall prey to that garbage. They're not going to do anything about guns in this country. They're not, because we're incapable right now of tackling serious issues in America. We don't have the capacity to do that anymore.
A friend of mine said to me argumentatively, things are exactly as people want them. And in a culture where, even nice older ladies watch Special Victims Unit and autopsy murder mysteries and so on, can we be surprised if all of a sudden CNN goes to its single topic mode and, for 3 days there's coverage of one of these mass shootings that end up resulting in basically nothing? If people really wanted to change it, wouldn't it have changed overnight? There's a thing about guns and American identity.
There's a thing about guns and American identity.
Yeah.
So he's saying that that's who we are.
He's saying
and we're happy with it.
That there's a special excitement that happens when, breaking news and everybody's all glued to the CNN and it's all the school shooting, and it's almost like the shows that we're watching.
Yeah, of course. I don't watch it.
Yeah.
I have no interest in watching CNN.
Yeah.
It's porn. It's gun porn. First of all, I have things to do.
Yeah.
When I hear there's a school shooting, I go, okay, and I don't run to CNN because it's unfolding, and as long as my kids aren't in the school and I'm not under threat, all I can do is keep doing what I'm doing, and at the end of the day, I'll get the body count, and then I'll hear the politicians talk about praying, how they're thoughting to the victims, and we move on. To watch CNN, there are other things going on besides these school shootings, and there are about 10 facts that I need to know. I don't need to see the reporter on the ground choking back tears. It's a school, that's not coverage of an event. That's not news. Mm-hmm. There's this myth about, I don't know if you have it in Canada, but there's this idea that there's a virtue to live television when it comes to covering the news, as though if it's live, it's happening now. Live television is garbage. Live news is garbage. A live interview with somebody is garbage because it's not reporting. Reporting is asking questions and then editing and making a story out of it. Having Governor Scott of Florida in the Situation Room with Wolf Blitzer live, that's cowardless. That's cowardice because you use time to camouflage your answers. Governor Scott knows that he's got 5 minutes with Wolf Blitzer, so he can prevaricate. He can be sly and slippery. But if you do a taped interview with these guys, and that's what I do on my podcast, I don't do a lot. Podcasts are not live. What I do is I keep asking the same questions over and over again. This isn't live. I'm going to ask you this question over and over again until you answer it. This idea that things have to be live is garbage. That's why 60 Minutes in America is still a respected, valuable source of news because they don't do it live. The live Sunday shows, is anybody on a live Sunday show, is anybody on Meet the Press, or this week with George Stephanopoulos, these Sunday shows, has anybody in the history of these shows ever said, "You got me"? You're right. No, it's never going to happen on a live newscast because all these people are trained to vamp. Look at Kellyanne Conway.
Yeah.
Has she ever said, "Oh, you got me"? This woman is able to go on the news every day and lie because it's live television. Put Kellyanne Conway, put her on a show that's taped, and when she says something, say that's a lie, and then look it up, then Google it. But that requires work and thinking, and it's all about money in America. It's all about the NRA making money. It's about the networks making money. The only reason they cover these school shootings is because the gremlins, we all just, not me, but we all run to the television to watch it.
It's less exciting than talking about healthcare.
Healthcare is complicated. It's a $3 trillion business in America. It's very complicated because it's a $3 trillion business. And the only way we're going to get universal health insurance is by demonizing an entire industry, the health insurance industry. There's too much money. Too much money. If there's $3 trillion a year to be made in healthcare, people will throw so much dirt in your eyes during the debate, you won't be able to follow the conversation.
Okay.
And my feeling is we treat healthcare the same way we treat the Iraq War. We had another criminal regime, George W. Bush and Dick Cheney, who decided they wanted a war in Iraq, and it was complicated. We had a president, a foolish guy who didn't know the difference between a Shiite and a Sunni, and that's a fact. That is a fact. He did not know that there were Sunnis and Shiites and Kurds in Iraq, and it didn't happen until the civil war in Iraq broke out after the invasion. And the Republicans and some of the Democrats said, well, war is messy. And, you go, and Donald Rumsfeld said, you go to war with the army and the equipment you have, not the army and the equipment you wish you had. You make mistakes during war, but if it's a noble cause, it's okay for people to die. It's okay to waste billions of dollars because we're doing the Lord's work. And that's how America always justifies going to war. We're going to destroy a lot of lives and waste a lot of money, but in the end, you'll be happy. And we never, ever, since World War II, end up happy. We just end up further in debt. But we're willing to go to war and make mistakes. But when it comes to health care, when it comes to actually providing health insurance for every American, somehow we have to be cautious and careful, and we can't be precipitous. We can't rush into this. But we know who the enemy is. We know who the enemy is when it comes to universal health care. It's Aetna. It's Blue Cross.
Yeah.
It's the insurers. We have to put them out of business.
80 years ago, a lot of proper countries solved this problem. Third payer, everybody's covered. And America missed the boat on that. Is that because of its capitalist ideology, or, I mean...
It's not capitalism. It's not capitalism. It's the reason we missed the boat is after World War II, or before World War II, we've been run by, I don't want to say oligarchs, but we've always been a country built on either free labor or cheap labor, and the mass media working with the Edward Bernays, since the dawn of the 20th century, we've learned how to keep people frightened and patriotic. Keep people convinced that this is the greatest place on earth and we need to protect it by getting guns and building up our military. We're going to spend $700 billion next year on defense. So the gift of Trump, if there is any gift, a broken clock is right twice a day. The gift of Trump could be that we'll have a crippled president who can't really do anything except for ICE, except for ICE and the rounding up of these people who live here in America, which is just the worst thing. And it's now, the numbers are worse than it was bad under Obama, the number that they were around it, but it's far worse than it was under Obama now. The gift to Trump is perhaps, maybe we're going to find out that the president can be crippled and the country goes on. We don't trust the president. The gift could be that he can't lead us into a war because we don't trust him. That might be the gift, is that maybe we're going to discover that the CIA is too big, that maybe some, I hate to quote Steve Bannon, but he wants to dismantle the administrative state here in the United States. Maybe we're going to learn that a lot of the things we're paying for in the Pentagon aren't necessary, and that the real threats are not military but cyber threats like Russia. Mm-hmm. But you know what? In America, we can learn these things, and the American people can want change. But as long as there's money to be made, we're not going to get it. Even the NRA, the people who belong to the NRA want sensible gun laws. You poll the NRA members, they want sensible gun laws. They don't even get, you don't even get what you want if you're a member of the NRA in this country.
Most people want gun control. I think a lot of people don't want to have to sell the house if they get sick. A lot of the times people don't agree with foreign policy. It's as if the government simply has not been representing the actual needs of its citizens for a very long time.
I think in Canada, I understand you have problems with your treatment of Indigenous Canadians.
Yeah.
I understand that. I have not I've been so caught up in this country, but I'm a big fan of Canada, and I think you guys do get what you want. I think you're better educated. If I meet somebody from Canada, they're well spoken. They're much better informed about the United States. But the racism, from what I'm hearing about the treatment of Indigenous Canadians, I hear it's pretty horrific and swept under the table, right?
My understanding is that there's problems with the treatment of natives both in Canada and the United States. The one little difference is there are communities where we took them away and trained them in special schools. We've sort of delegated them to reservations. I mean, it's not something we're proud of.
Yeah, I hear it's actually getting worse in Canada, but it's underreported. That is what I'm hearing. But
well, it's not getting worse. We got rid of those ridiculous schools, and we've made some reparations, and they have been able to form their own forms of government, and we now call them First Nations. But largely they are sort of relegated to these reservations, and life standards of quality drinking water, and opportunity is very limited.
Yeah.
So, but it is a problem.
Well,
everywhere, right? It's the after effects of colonialism, essentially, which is everywhere, whether you're in Australia or the United States, Canada.
Find us on Twitter @thatarcher, our podcast page, tmi.twxnet.com. Rate the show on iTunes. It changes the way the show is listed.
You're happy with the health insurance that you get, right?
I'm glad you asked that. I'd like to say I would surrender my life to protect our form of healthcare. Without a doubt.
Well, that's what we're already doing that in the United States.
Yes, you are, sadly. But as a Canadian citizen, I would fight to the death to protect Canadian healthcare. There are always little attempts to try to privatize sectors of it or create a multi-tier system here. We hear a lot of complaining and bellyaching, but I think you would hear that in any country about any system. The British complain about theirs. But bottom line is that if a family member gets an illness, they don't have to sit in a rocking chair and die, or the family doesn't lose their house. That is, I think it's part of the pride of Canada, in my opinion.
Yeah.
Yeah, and Americans would be just as proud the second they had a system like it. That's my opinion. And rich people will always be able to get their special rich people doctors no matter what. So, I mean, the arguments against it, I don't get. I really don't.
Yeah. Donald Sutherland's uncle? Who gave you guys the health insurance?
You've got it right. Absolutely. This is, I think, a Tommy Douglas. He pushed for it. And, yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
The other myth about America is, and I don't have the numbers here, but people will say, well, we have to pay more for health care because all the big pharmaceutical companies are headquartered in the United States. Nobody realizes that, I don't know the numbers, but a majority of the big pharmaceutical companies are in Canada, Germany, England, especially with tax inversions. They leave the United. Anyway, yeah.
Well, here's a thing that we did in Ontario. People I think under 25 now have a drug plan. So if you're a young person and you're on an expensive medication, that's even covered now. I mean, all you have to do is throw in dental care and that'd be it. It'd be perfect. But this is the idea is to try to take profit out of medicine, and the American argument is then there'd be no incentive for innovation. I mean, that's the I don't know how, but that is an argument that I hear from Americans.
Yeah, well, if you don't understand how innovation works, that sounds good, but it's the National Institute of Health, the NIH, a government-sponsored agency that does all the innovation and then hands it over to private enterprise to go make money with it. But it starts with the NIH. The idea that you can have a free market, the free market's a myth anyway, but the idea that people are innovating without government supervision or government help is nonsense. And I don't think scientists and doctors are trying to cure disease because they want to make $10 billion. I think they're trying to cure disease because they want to make $10 million. They want to get rich, maybe, but they also want to be in books and be remembered.
Yeah.
You don't need, I can understand why a doctor wants to make $10 million for inventing this amazing machine. There's no excuse for them to be making $10 billion off it or a drug. That's just sick.
I've manipulated you into spending twice the amount of time so far.
How long have we done this for? How long has this been?
We're around 37-ish, 30 some odd minutes.
All right.
I do before you go want to ask you about your podcast. So you have these guests, Corey Brettschneider, Howie Klein, Joe DeVito, Jackie the Joke Man Martling, Dave Cyrus, Aaron Berg, Dr. Jay Sute, John Ross. These are regular guests on your show. They're recurring characters. It's so funny, so intelligent.
Oh, thank you.
What is going on? How is it even possible?
How is what possible?
Your show. It's so entertaining.
Oh, thank you. Well, that's so sweet of you. Thank you. I try to get a mixture of really funny people who are smart and passionate. And then I have found that there are people who aren't comedians who are often funnier than comedians. The podcast. I've been doing the podcast since 2009, and as we were talking before we started, that there are no advertisements. The conversations can go as long as they're supposed to. And if you're on a drive somewhere or on a train or you're at work, and you can get sucked into a real conversation, and it happens to me. I listen to these things, and podcasting is. I do a radio show for Pacifica. I do a radio show with Ralph Nader, and I have my own radio show for Pacifica. And they're highly edited. Not highly edited, but they have to be edited because you can't waste people's time with radio, nor should you. But with a podcast, you can skip ahead if you don't like something. You can let people decide how much they're going to invest in a segment.
It also comes with show notes, so you can basically see what it's about before you listen to it. You don't get that with radio sometimes. So how is it competing with radio? Is it going to kill radio, or will it sit beside radio?
I think radio in America kills radio. I mean, radio is... This is another... I mean, I don't know. You've probably talked about this. Radio has been taken over by Wall Street. The vast, I think every radio station in America, they have some low power stations that are independent, but most radio stations, if you got more than 5,000 watts, 10,000 watts, you're owned by a conglomerate, by CBS, by Viacom, by Salem, by Cumulus. These are right-wing, Clear Channel. These are right-wing. A lot of them are Christian. I think Salem, I'm not sure, but I think Salem is a religious broadcasting group that also has conservative right-wing stations. You have Sinclair Broadcasting buying up stations, very right-wing. Every radio station in America, and I will back it, and by every I mean like 90% of every radio station in America now is owned by one of 5 conglomerates with a right-wing agenda. Other than, maybe CBS or Viacom isn't so right-wing, but for the most part, they're owned by right-wing corporations who, by the way, will preach the free market, whatever that means, and they're all in debt.
Mm-hmm.
Clear Channel is in debt. They bought up all these radio stations, and they can't service the debt. Premier Radio Networks, debt. They're all in debt. They're all broke. They all have to answer to the bankers, but they have Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity, these goons, these thugs, talking about austerity and how we have to balance the budget here in America. Meanwhile, the very own station that they're operating on, the people that they're working for, are up to their ass in debt. And the way they service that debt is they play right-wing talk show hosts who aren't local. They don't do any local news. They don't service the local economy. And that's what radio is in America.
What about NPR?
They run advertisements on NPR now, and it's corporate controlled, and they do the false equivalency. They don't. Do you hear Noam Chomsky on NPR? You're not going to hear anything that disturbs you on NPR. There's nothing on NPR that is going to challenge the status quo on NPR.
In Canada, we have the CBC, which is our sort of version of NPR. And what you say is true of the CBC as well. It's not going to be challenging. The sad part is there's this sort of, it's as if journalists don't want to cross the line and ever be called activists, even when the news that they could be reporting might, come very close to triggering activism. You're never going to be surprised. But on the other hand, when you compare NPR to regular radio or CBC to regular radio, it does have at least a more liberal flavor to it. But
I disagree.
Yeah,
maybe neoliberal.
Okay,
but not. It'll be liberal on the nonsense,
right?
The stuff like the social issues, which divide, which are used to divide us in America. Keep our eyes off class warfare, which is what this really is. I mean, I'm not saying the Me Too movement is nonsense. It's important, and it's part of the class struggle. NPR will be good on that. They'll be good on tolerance and gay issues, because even the Republican Party is almost there on that. But on the corporate control, going after the 5 families who own like 60% of the wealth in this country, and that's the real problem, they're not going to touch that. They're not going to, they're not going to touch that. As my father used to say, ever thus. I learned that as you get older, things get better and they get worse at the same time. And I never really understood this until I, got older. And that is, everything that you achieve as a nation is at risk. Everything that you think, just you get Social Security, you get Medicare, you give the right, you finally give women the right to vote and African Americans the right to vote. There are still forces at work that want to take it all away from you. So it's constant vigilance, and you just have to keep fighting every step of the way for these things. I think the Canadians do a pretty great job. I'm going to be a little incendiary saying this. The Canadian people aren't as angry as Americans, I don't think. And I think we serve as a cautionary tale for you guys. And it must be. I think it's a little easier to have America as your neighbor and go, well, we certainly don't want to end up like they are.
One of the reasons why we're so captivated by your American news these days is because we are essentially living next to a drunken elephant that at any time could just roll over on us.
Yeah, well, no.
Another thing is...
We are a drunken elephant, but we're not going to... No. Yeah, I don't think.
Okay. The other thing is we're pretty happy right now because we have this Trudeau guy in who, largely... I mean, it's really ticking off a lot of the conservatives, but largely it's been easy going, long-term honeymoon. We really are still in love with his father, Pierre Elliott Trudeau. But the prime minister we had before him was quite Trumpian, quite, muzzling scientists and overly centralized power and a bizarre obsession with sweater vests. So we did go through a period of having an overly conservative prime minister just before this. So this is our swing from conservative to liberal, and we'll swing back again to crazy conservative. But that's sort of that's how they trick us into thinking we have a democracy. Essentially, we have two parties. They essentially have the same policies, no matter who gets in. And to make us feel like we have this sort of choice, we just swing from crazy liberal to crazy conservative and back and forth, and it continues the fallacy of it all.
Well, it's been great talking with you, David.
Well, one more thing. You have a show you're doing. You're doing stand-up gigs these days.
Oh, yeah. Well, I've been doing stand-up.
Can you give little plugs or just, what are you doing?
I still travel a little and do a little stand-up.
Yeah.
Mostly because I'm out of Manhattan now.
Yeah.
I don't know, going to Schenectady and going to, Long Island, I don't consider that a road gig. But it is, so I'm doing stand-up in and around the tri-state area here in New York and enjoying it. And I don't know if the audience is, but I am.
Do you have to do it several times a week to stay in the groove, no?
Yeah. I've taken time off in the past because I support myself by being a comedy writer, and it's hard to leave a room after, a comedy writing room after 12 days. It feels like 12 days, 12 hours.
Yeah.
And then walk into a club, the pilot light after 12 hours sometimes has been blown out.
Yeah.
And so, but, stand-up comedy is still the hardest thing to do. So I love the challenge, and it's real. and you get a pretty good gauge of where the country is on certain things by doing stand-up comedy. Although, the clubs are not the leading indicator. People who go to comedy clubs are just one demographic. They're, somebody who's out on a Saturday night drinking at a club, it's one type of person, but it's great.
Yeah.
Well, I gotta go. I gotta go deal with.
Give me a Twitter account. How do we get you on Twitter? How do we contact you? Your webpage? What do you want listeners to do?
Okay, so it's David_Feldman_ on Twitter.
Yeah.
You can friend me on Facebook. You can go to davidfeldmanshow.com, where you can find out what I'm up to and what my guests are up to. And on iTunes, if you want to listen to my podcast, you can find it on iTunes and Stitcher, or I think Spotify, YouTube. It goes out to all the. I hope it does. It goes out to all the people who deliver podcasts to your home or phone. We hit a button and
off it goes.
Goes somewhere. Yeah. When we launch them, and that is kind of cool. You hit a button and then somebody in Kenya can listen to you immediately.
My button says submit. I don't know how that makes me feel, but submit. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you. Have me back.
I'd love to have you back. And there's so many things I wanted to get to, like, what kind of kid you were. Did you get sent to the principal's office? How did you know comedy was going to be your career? All that stuff.
Well, we'll do it next time.
That was David Feldman, host of The David Feldman Show on iTunes, award-winning comedy writer and radio host. Smart, funny, and always entertaining, David Feldman spoke to us by phone from New York City. And for your information,
do you know that I just spoke to some Canadians? You talk about facts. Somehow, Fox News and Rush Limbaugh and the Republican Party have convinced many Americans that the Canadian healthcare system is a disaster and that we don't want what's going on in Great Britain. The fact is, I just spoke to some Canadians. They told me that they would be willing to die for their health care, that it's so good in Canada that they would be willing to die for it. The closest thing they have to a religion in Great Britain is universal health insurance. And yet, this $3 trillion a year industry has convinced Americans that socialized medicine won't work. I don't see any other way to do this than to declare war on the health insurance business and put it out of business. They're worse than tobacco.
I'm Dave Archer in Toronto.
And I'm David Feldman in Manhattan.